Good evening, everybody. It's a good afternoon. It's great to see so many of you here, especially in these times where we have to do all these talks in the virtual sphere. I invited Jan actually to give this talk in Berlin, and it would have been, of course, amazing to have you here, Jan. But thank you very much for being willing to participate still and provide us with this very current presentation today. So maybe to you as a researcher and your background. So you are a professor in information systems at the University of Passau, and you hold a chair for Internet and Telecommunications business. You're also director of the Passau International Center for Advanced Interdisciplinary Studies and the joint academic director at the Center on Regulation in Europe, CERRE, a Brussels-based think tank. Jan, you hold a diploma degree in business engineering and management, Wirtschaftsingenieurwesen, and a PhD in economics, both from KIT, Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. Jan has published numerous articles in leading journals in the areas of information systems, economics, and marketing. And as I really want to emphasize some seminal papers in the field of, or on the topic of network neutrality, I think your survey 2013 in telecommunications policy is one of the most cited surveys, and if I may say that, I said it before in private, of course, a very, very good and highly recommended article. Your current research interests include the regulation of telecommunications and internet markets, the digital ecosystems, and data-driven business models. And if I may say on a more personal note, Jan and I think he partly forgot, but we met in 2013 when I was a PhD student, and I attended a conference of the International Telecommunications Society in Florence, Italy. And I was part of a PhD seminar, and we got assigned mentors, and Jan was my mentor. And I still vividly recall our discussions about net neutrality. I think my paper was net neutrality, and had some arguments on innovation in the internet ecosystem. And I still remember that from your side, at some point, the word transcendent was chosen to discuss my ideas. It was very funny, and it was a very stimulating exchange, I have to tell you, and I highly appreciated that you took so much time and gave me such a good feedback, and I always very much enjoy having your research input and, of course, reading your paper. So before starting the talk again, I think some more people have joined in the meantime. We will record this talk only Jan's screen. We will not record the Q&A session afterwards. So if anybody's uncomfortable with this and does not consent, we have to, as I said before, unfortunately have to ask you to leave the meeting. Of course, we would love to have all of you in the talk. So if you have questions, please, as Jan said, please put them in the chat. We have this chat function here. Just use it. Whenever you have a question, put it there, and we can collect them, and then we can, I think, efficiently enter the Q&A after the talk. So I'm very thrilled and delighted that Jan is here today and gives a talk about data portability in digital markets, economic implications, and policy recommendations. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Jan Krämer.
Volker, thank you very much for the very kind introduction, raising barriers of expectation to a level I can absolutely not meet. But I'm very delighted to be invited here. As Volker said, should have been in person in Berlin, and I would have very much liked that. Actually, never visited the Weizenbaum Institute so far. But different times, different means. So this is why we do this in this format. I'm very happy to have such a diverse crowd of people here, and people also, of course, I'm familiar with. The talk I'm giving is largely based on a research report we just did for the Center of Regulation in Europe, where I'm a joint academic director, but it's also based on research we did and published before. So let me see what the clicking works here. Okay, so let me show you the agenda for the talk. I want to do four things. First, I want to just also catering a little bit to the diverse crowd. First, I want to go very briefly, I'm not a legal scholar, but very briefly into the EU legal framework on data portability as it is now, and also pointing out some potential limitations. Then I'm going to highlight for the technical people in the room, which they will probably be familiar with, one particular project in the area of data portability called the Data Transfer Project, and what it does and what it does not do. And then for the most part, I'll be focusing, as the title suggested, on the economic aspects of data portability, where the literature stands on this, and also some new aspects. And finally, I'll go into the policy recommendations coming from putting all of these aspects together. What's important is I have to make two sort of notes before I start. First, what I'm going to say here is largely focused on portability of personal data in online markets. Data portability is a huge topic. There is, of course, personal and non-personal data, and there's also, as I'll show you on the next slides, different legislations relating to this. And of course, here I'll be focusing really on platform markets, online markets, and not so much, for example, on industrial data, which is important. Then also a note of clarification with respect to what do I mean by data portability, because this is, like net neutrality, this is sort of becoming a loaded term, and different people understand different things when they talk about data portability. So I want to make two things clear. When I talk about data portability, I mean one-way data transfer from one data controller to another data controller. And the other data controller can also be the data subject itself. But what is important as well as the second point here is that it's done on the explicit request of the data subject. So what I'm not talking about in the narrow sense, and we can do this in the Q&A a little bit, is interoperability. And what I'm also not talking about is sort of data sharing requests by an authority, for example. So this is really on the request of data subjects consenting that his or her data is being ported to another data controller, one directional. So this is really what I'm talking about. Okay, so what does the legal framework look like, very much in brief, on the specific subject of data portability? There is both horizontal regulation as well as sector-specific regulation. And then there's regulation concerning personal data and non-personal data. As I said, we will be focusing on personal data here. So the most important aspect, of course, is the GDPR and Article 20 in GDPR. And I have a dedicated slide on that coming up next. Of course, you can also have potentially sharing of data under the realm of competition law. So I'm not going to go into detail on this. But theoretically, it's possible, although in Europe, and there's numerous reports on this, the legal barriers, of course, are going to be very high. Then there is legislation on non-personal data. Specifically noteworthy in the context of this talk is the Digital Content Directive, which also has a clause when you terminate a contract with a digital service, that you are able to take your non-personal data with you to the new service provider. And this has been drafted explicitly as a complement to GDPR, which allows you to take your personal data with you. So these really go hand in hand. And then there's the free flow of data regulation, which is more in a B2B context, and also a little bit more focused on non-personal data. So this is when you switch cloud service providers, for example. And then there is specific sector-specific regulation. Most interestingly, in this context, the PSD2, and even more interestingly, what has been done in the UK in the context of open banking. And I'll be coming back to this point because one of the policy recommendations, as a spoiler here, one of the policy recommendations that we'll be making is that we need more continuous data portability, as we'll call it, so through APIs, and this is very much closely related to what has been envisioned in PSD2 and specifically in the UK in the open banking sector. And for completeness, there's also other types of regulation, sector-specific regulation, mostly relating to non-personal, however, which is in the, of course, in motor vehicle regulation, so access to car data, also for maintenance purposes and in the electricity directive. So please don't ask me too much detail on these. As I said, I want to focus on the economic aspects. But here's the specific slide now on Article 20 GDPR, which we spent some time with understanding exactly what it can do and what it cannot do. So the first thing we have to clarify is what is the scope of the data that is covered under Article 20 GDPR. So the provision in GDPR that allows data portability. And the scope is it doesn't really specifically what I have on the slides here. This is already sort of the interpretations by European data supervisors. But there's volunteer data. So volunteer data is basically the data that you actively and knowingly provided to a data controller, which is your name, your age, your email address, but also explicit likes. For example, you might have made liking songs or liking websites or something like this. And then there's observed data. Observed data is the data that you are providing implicitly by using a service, which can be your searches, location data, but also data tracked by a wearable device, for example. And then you could have inferred data, so data that is inferred and refined through algorithms or so, for example, from one of these data sources or combined with other data sources. So what is pretty clear is that inferred data is not in the scope of data portability, but where there is some uncertainty is in the context of observed data. Generally speaking, observed data should be covered, but then if you think about how detailed this can be, so that potentially every ad you clicked on is subject to data portability. And if you then, those of you that have actually requested data portability at one of those providers, you will see that this basically is never included in the data set that is subject to be data portable. So there is some legal uncertainty here, and there's also, GDPR generally speaking is not a law specifically, it's a horizontal regulation. It's not specific to the digital markets and the digital economy. However, it's of course it can potentially have a large impact here because data portability is or the Article 20 GDPR only concerned with data that is actually being processed by automated means, which generally will be the case in the digital economy. But that probably will have to see, court cases and how this evolves in legal practice to delineate really here the limits of observed data. But this is also something I'll be coming back to. This will be crucial for the success and the effect, having actually an effective data portability for the digital economy specifically. Now, what some of the limitations of GDPR that will also become important? First, I said, okay, data needs to be processed by automated means. That generally is the case in the digital economy, of course. Then there is no specific data format required pursuant to a data portability request. So it just says it has to be common machine readable. But this, of course, makes it potentially very difficult, for the computer scientists in the room, that just because it's common machine and readable doesn't mean you can just plug and play it from one service to another, let alone you have sort of a proper schema for implementing and importing and exporting this. So the next thing is that GDPR gives you have to comply with such requests without undue delay, and you generally have up to 1 month to reply with it. So, which means that you don't have sort of a continuous flow of data from one service to another. Let's assume you would want to multi-home between two services. You're using, let's say, Google for search, and then you want to have your search data in another service. You would have to sort of repeat these data portability requests, and also in this case, Google or Microsoft as a search engine provider would have a couple of days or hours or whatever undue is deemed proper here in this context. So, but you cannot really have a seamless integration of one service with another on the under the scope of Article 20 GDPR. Then there is also some legal uncertainty. At least this is being discussed with the rights of with respect to the rights of others being affected. So data portability is one provision. There are other provisions, of course, as well. Particularly if you think about, you have pictures online and you have tagged people in the pictures, and now you want to port those from one provider to another. What about the people that you have tagged in the photos? Do they need to consent to that data portability as well? If you don't have a consent or dissent, does it mean those pictures are not being ported? Who is then liable? And these are some of the legal questions addressed here. There's also potentially a tension between the principle of data minimization and the data portability. So if you port data from one provider to another, this might also include, for example, a lot of data that the new provider doesn't necessarily need in the narrow sense to fulfill data minimization. So then it would have to delete that kind of data and so on. So you see that there can be some tensions here as well. All right, so much for the legal part. Next, I want to go to the technical part, where I want to highlight one specific project that pops up repeatedly in the policy debate on being sort of the silver bullet of where we want to get at. And this is the data transfer project. And I just have one slide basically on this. Because there's a lot you can say technically. What I want to do is I want to highlight a little bit the status of this and what this actually is about. So this data transfer project, if you go on the website datatransferproject.dev, then you will see that there's very prominently highlighted a number of marquee developers of this open source project, which is Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Twitter. The truth is this project originated from a Google project that lived, so the data transfer project, if you look at the website, it says it was initiated in 2018. The truth is it is older than this, and it was previously called Data Liberation Front and was a Google only project. And then they made this sort of a more prominent thing among these big tech firms. And the main idea, before I go a little bit more into detail on this, the main idea is that you can basically have data portability on a click basis. So you just click and you can transfer your data from one service to another. So typically, this would involve, as you can see sort of on the left side here, this would involve if you have n number of providers, then there's n times n minus 1/2 potential links, and so potential transfers you could do. And of course, this doesn't really scale well. So the idea of the data transfer project is to have data adapters, an import adapter and an export adapter, and each participant, let's say Google or Microsoft, is writing sort of for their data that they have an import and an export adapter in one common format. That is sort of a centralized common format called the data models here. And then the new provider can sort of port the data from this common format to its format using its import adapter. So there's the idea is that if you're Microsoft, you have an import adapter for certain data, and you have an export adapter for certain data, and you sort of parse it into that format, going to this centralized common format in the middle, and from there it's then ported to the new provider. And this, of course, scales much better because it can scale linearly with the number of firms involved. So that's the basic promise of this data transfer project. If you go a little bit more into detail, I already told you about these export adapters and these import adapters. And then the way that this works is they use so-called verticals. So for specific types of data, so mail data, photo data, and they have a data model for each of these. And typically the data that you have, for example, at Facebook there will be some data is photo data, some data is chat data, some data is mail data, and then you can sort of export that in one common format and then import it. Of course, as always, the devil's in the detail, and there's how to specify these data models specifically, and also how to do the transfer specifically. There's a lot of different possibilities how you can implement this, how you do the authentication at the different providers and so on. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. We can have a little more discussion on this a little bit later on. What I want to highlight is that The idea, of course, and the way I presented it is very good. So it's a way forward from where we are currently. But keep in mind, these companies are involved. So these are no lightweight companies, right? So these are heavyweight big tech companies on the one hand. This project has been officially launched in 2018, but is older than that. And now, and it's been very prominently highlighted in the policy debates. Now, if you take all of that together, you might assume that if there's a vetted interest in actually pursuing this, that there should be, tremendous progress in this project. If firms like that are involved with the side of financial resources and programming and skill work that they have, and if they're doing this for 2 years plus, that there should be some progress, but that's actually not the case. So if you look at, and there's some statistics I can show you here, what you see down here is sort of the number of, this is an open source project. So what people can do is they contribute code and then commit it online to the platform. This is on GitHub. And you can see here sort of the number of commits over time, starting sort of in 2018 to 2020. And you can see, there's some little activity here, but this is really not super many commits in terms of 40 commits, for example, at certain points. And this is really, just slowly progressing, if progressing at all down here. And so there's not that progress being made. And the second thing you can notice is that who is actually the firms committing code to this? So who's actually involved? And it still very much is a Google project. Recently, Facebook has been very vocal about this. But actually, if you look at sort of the proportion of changes, commits that's being done by different institutions, and it's over 80% by Google, about 10% by Facebook, and only 6% by others. Which means if you go back to the companies here, Apple, I don't think they have made a single commit. Twitter is really not involved, and Microsoft, I don't know from the top of my head, but only little. If you then even look at not only the commits, but even the actually how many lines of code have been done, then you see that the Facebook involvement is even less than that. Now you might say, well, maybe this is this unusual or not? Now let's compare this with some project that they actually have vetted interest in, Google and Facebook. And this is their machine learning frameworks. If you think of Google, then there's TensorFlow. And with the data transfer project, where there's 4 of the big tech companies involved, we have 44,000 lines of code and hundreds of forks. So 100 of forks is how many different sort of variations have been created. And with TensorFlow, it's just different order of magnitudes, 2.5 million lines of code, 80,000 forks. PyTorch is sort of the comparable machine learning framework from Facebook. Similarly, 1 million lines of code, 10,000 forks. So you see, this is in a completely different ballpark. This is project where they have vetted interest in. This is a project that probably only set up to sort of please regulators a little bit, but there's not much progress being made. All right, so now going through the legal and the technical aspects, I'm now going to settle a little bit on the economic aspects of data portability. First, some basics on data and why data portability is interesting from an economic perspective. Of course, you all know data is non-rival in use, so it can be used without depleting it. But this does not mean that data is ubiquitously available or that anyone can just derive value from data. And that is really important to keep that apart. Of course, you can exclude access to data by legal means, by technical means, but you can also, and this is the 2 points I want to highlight here, the collection of data is actually highly contested. I mean, there's some scholars out there that repeatedly argue that the data is ubiquitous. Everyone can collect it, and data like names, email addresses, and so on, everyone can collect it. And I, to a large part, I disagree. If you think about very static type of data, so really names, and maybe also your birth date and so on, then this is to some degree true that a lot of entities have your name and your birth date probably when you register. But it's just not true, particularly for behavioral type of data and the sort of continuous observed data that you do, and also not for a large part of volunteer data when it comes to sort of behavioral, like click data, data that you have on likes and so on. And I make 2 points to prove that. One is that there's some publications in computer science, one, for example, here by Engelhardt and Arayan, who studied on the top 1 million websites, according to Alexa, which type of third-party trackers were installed. And they show that 70% of the websites roundabout employ tracking devices by Alphabet or Google, and about 30% of the websites employ tracking devices by Facebook. Different variants that they have for tracking. And which means that, and then there is, so there's 70% Google and there's 30% Facebook. Of course, sometimes there's installed concurrently on the same sites. And then for a long time, there's nothing. Yeah? And I think Twitter is the next coming in at about 10% or so, or 5%. Which shows you that there's only a very low number of firms, particularly Alphabet and Facebook here, which are actually able to track user behavior across different websites. And this sort of result is corroborated by Ghostery, which is a browser plugin, which sort of came up with the same kind of, actually a browser plugin blocking, tracking software or tracking and cookies and so on. And they came up with roughly the same percentage. So it is really the number of firms that can really track and collect data on users across the web is really highly limited. And because of that, also these recent privacy moves by Google's and others, that they're now raising privacy concerns, for example, that they're disabling browser cookies as a move towards more privacy, really is more approved toward protecting more their monopoly on tracking, because they have different means to track now with first-party type of cookies, or tracking through the browser directly, or if you're Facebook, you can track, for example, using your social login with Facebook, you can track people. You don't have to rely on these crude sort of cookie measures that have been prevalent on the internet today. Now, the second point I wanted to make is that also the value generation from data is contested. So even if you had access to the data, we have to acknowledge that you cannot just, sell the same data sets and make twice the money from it. Especially if data is actually, and there are some theoretical papers here that show that basically in the limit, when there's really no differentiation possible, because you have the same data set, then only exclusive data really has value to the data seller, and not data that is duplicated, because basically you will just compete yourself down with the other seller on that particular data point. So which then means that data sharing can indeed lead to fierce competition, and also potentially destroy investment incentives also in the collection of data, but also in these digital business models. So sometimes, and this is of course economically speaking not completely correct, but sometimes I like to say, well, you have this non-rivalry of data, but there are some limits to this in terms of there is rivalry into the collection, and there's rivalry in the value generation. Of course, rivalry relates to the use, the consumption, and these others do not. So this is, strictly speaking, is of course economically not correct, but still I think it's a good analogy to stress that trade-off. Okay, now specifically to the economic literature that has looked at the effects of data portability. Actually, there is not a lot here. Of course, you can think of data portability as a means that will just lower the cost of switching from one service to another. And then there is a large I/O literature originating in the mid-'80s by Krämer and others. This is just a small selection of papers here. Weizsäcker has also one of the first papers on this, on classic papers on switching costs and also converters. So in the context of different networks where you can sort of convert the value of one network, make it compatible to another network. So this is relevant here if you just think of data portability as a switching cost. And there's some newer literature that has specific, and they of course didn't have data portability in mind when they made these papers. And then there's a newer strand of literature that has looked at data portability in this context specifically. Still kind of very nascent. One of the first I'm aware of is actually Michael Wohlfahrt. He was a PhD student with me that dedicated some time in his PhD on this and developed one of the first sort of models post the traditional IO models from the 80s, who showed that there can be some unintended consequences of data portability that can actually lower consumer surplus, or at least not be beneficial to everyone. So I'm not going, also because of the diversity here of this crowd, I'm not going to go, these are all game theoretical models, and of course they all have assumptions and they all have shortcomings and so on. So I'm not going to go through all of these models one by one. I just want to carve out sort of their main implications, and then also what they have in common and what we can learn from this. So in Michael Wohlfahrt's paper, he showed that consumer surplus can actually, with data portability, can be higher or lower, and particularly it can be lower when the entrance service is indeed better, so making it a little bit worse. But total surplus will always increase with data portability. So he basically has a hoteling framework and a two-period hoteling framework with entry. And then there's also a paper I did with another PhD student on where we also have a two-period model, and we look at not only how much data is being collected, so also how much data is being disclosed on a data market, for example. And then we can show that in the advent of data portability, the incumbent will actually disclose more data. So the logic sort of is here that without data portability, you're sort of competing for the first period customers a little bit more in order to exploit them in the second period. So a little bit more wary on the disclosure in the first period. So an incumbent, if you have data portability, you know there's going to be fierce competition later on. You cannot retain those customers so easily, so that you will disclose more data in the first period right away. And this will lead also to sort of a worse deal at the new entrant, and some consumers in the end can be worse off. There's another paper by Lam and Liu in the Journal of Industrial Organization recently appeared, which show also, this at first seems counterintuitive, that data portability can actually raise entry barriers. And here the idea is that because of data portability, consumers are more willing, in a sense, to give data to the current incumbent because they feel less locked in. And because they give more data, the incumbent can do better algorithmic learning on this, which then raises the entry barriers for an entrant. So this is the basic trade-off that they're highlighting. And there's also a working paper by Hidaji, who also makes a point that data portability can leave some consumers worse off and actually be worse for entrants. Now, again, highlighting that these are theoretical papers, there are no empirical papers. Actually, they don't, to best of my knowledge, if you have anything, if you don't have, if you know more papers than this, please let me know. But I'm not aware of any specific empirical paper that looks at data portability. Of course, there's a number of empirical papers now that look at the impact of GDPR, and this is hugely important. But I'm aware of no paper that specifically looks at the empirical paper specifically looks at the role and the effectiveness and the impact of data portability under GDPR. And so this is the first caveat, that these are theoretical papers. And of course, they're also designed in a way to highlight what kind of effects can occur. It does not say that these effects are necessarily the prevalent effects. Of course, the logic of switching costs and lowering switching costs, which makes generally markets more competitive, will also prevail. This is sort of the theme of the papers from the 80s. Now, with data portability, you can still, I think, have some general themes from these theoretical papers. The first is what they show that with data portability, consumers, in a sense, feel more safe and reveal more data than they would have if there were not data portability. That does not mean that they're actually porting their data, but just the presence of data portability means that you might be willing to give away more data to the incumbent and therefore sort of make the incumbent even stronger and never actually exercise the right to do data portability. It's just, you know, something that comforts you. And similar results are also shown by some empirical papers on GDPR generally, that because you have more control rights now about data, you're more willing to reveal data, although you're not potentially exercising on those control rights. These papers also reveal that the horizontal nature of the regulation might be a problem. This is also something that empirical papers generally on GDPR are highlighting, that it might benefit incumbents, not only for the fact that they might deal better with the transaction costs involved, the compliance costs involved, but also because being big in the market in the first place sort of gives them some advantage if there's not a differentiated regulation with respect to incumbents and entrants. And the third point is, which is sometimes neglected also, especially in the legal debate on this and also in the technical debate, is which is clear for economists, that if you introduce something like that, it's not like the incumbent is static and will not change whatever the incumbent does, right? So if you introduce data portability, there will be a strategic reaction by the incumbent, for example, revealing more data, disclosing more data than it did before. That have to be taken into account. We cannot assume the world being static as it is sometimes being assumed. Now, with that, I want to move on to another large topic, which I think has not been addressed so much in the literature so far, which we do address in this report I highlighted before, is the specific role of personal data information management systems in this context. So what are personal information management systems, or PIMS for short? They offer sort of a centralized dashboard, or that's the idea at least, sort of a centralized dashboard where you can do basically at least two things. First is you can sort of control the different data flows that you have consented to at the various providers, right? So if you have more prevalent data portability, you first need to know where have I given my consent for data processing in the first place, and where have I consented to data being ported, and then you need to monitor the data flows and see where is it going, is it going well? So PIMS sort of offer at the minimum sort of a solution to handle that flow of your personal data between different providers, and also as a means to collect it. And PIMS can do much more than that. And there's a number of instantiations, demonstration instantiations of this. There's a number of papers also from a technical side being written on this. Here's a collection of things that have been mentioned in these. So identity management is one that they're not only used for consent and data flows, but also to identify yourself at various services. Permission management can be another one, overview of the transactions connections, including the management of the legal rights and consent. So this is what I highlighted before. Service management, linking the various data sources, value exchange. So maybe potentially also, getting money for the data you have there and selling it potentially. This is an area of personal data brokers, which I'll come back to. And I'm not going to go through all of these now. But you see there's a number of different things that people see also under a personal information management system. So they're heavily discussed sort of also as a legal, as a technical silver bullet that can really facilitate things. What we want to look at now in the next couple slides is if they're so good, why don't we see more of them? And why are they not working in practice? And will they ever work in practice? And there's two facets to this story. The first facet is that one of the things that is really hindering the emergence of personal information management systems is that there's no real standards for doing all of this. for identity management, permission management, service management, value exchange, and so on, right? So if you are a personal information management system, you need to create sort of a data model and a dedicated API and a dedicated converter for each and every service that might be there. And each and every service provider can change its standard at any time because there's no obligation to stick with a certain standard. Because you just have to comply as a data portability request with a common machine readable format and not a specific format, it's really going to be a tedious task. So this is the technical side of the story. And the story that I'm focusing on next is the question, can there ever be a sustainable business model for these personal information management systems, even if we overcome the lack of standards in this area? And if you think about potential business models for personal information management systems, there's basically four things or four different business models, very crudely speaking, that you might be thinking of. You can, on the one hand, you can say, well, I want to create revenue from the data that consumers have ported to me, to the personal information management system. So I'm trying to create value from the data I have there. The second issue is, or the second potential source of revenue could be that you actually get revenue from the data controllers themselves. And the third potential business model could be that you derive revenue from the data subjects. And the fourth solution might frankly be there's no revenue generation as well. This is, we're just going to subsidize this as a society. So I'm going to go through all of these now and discuss a little bit the pros and cons and how likely it is. And you should keep these little icons here, make note of the icons, because on the slides now you'll see with the icon which of these revenue models I'll be talking about, in case you get lost a little bit. So let's start first with generating revenue from data, which is heavily discussed and is something that we see a lot of times, being a solution that data as labor, you participate from the value of data ownership, this is sort of in the context of this discussion. The first question is, from an economic perspective, why would you ever transfer data to a personal information management system? Why would you want to do that? And I see basically three reasons. The first is that you say, well, I want to exert some competitive pressure on the big tech guys, creating alternative seller on the data market, limiting their market power. The second issue could be that you say, well, I just want to gain more control over how this data is being sold on data markets. So I want to have more say in how it's being monetized. And the third is, well, frankly, I want to participate. I want to make some money from this now. So the first point is on the competitive pressure. Well, of course, this is something that you need to consent to. Only few people will do so. Only few people will use a PIMS, even if it makes perfectly sense. And so in the end, only a fraction of data can ever be ported. So this also already questions whether you can actually have the same number of collected data that you can actually use to exercise some competitive pressure. So will PIMS in a world like that ever be able to compete with sort of inferior data that they have, because they can only work on the data that is subject to portability first, and second, they only have a fraction of the users porting the data? I think it's highly questionable. On the second point is gaining more control on the sale of data. So if you think that through, let's say you would own, first of all, the data that the PIMS has is only the data that you ported. It doesn't mean it's being deleted at the original data controller. So the original data controller usually still has the data, particularly if the PIMS is only sort of a bucket where you put the data in, but there's nothing you can actually, the PIMS is not offering a service that you're using. So if you're on a social network and you're uploading pictures and you're doing chat there, and you're porting the data to a PIMS, then basically you're just porting it there for the PIMS to sort of sell it for you, but you don't do anything you're not creating original data at the PIMS. So therefore, the original data controller will have the same data. And so if you think about it, you want to exert more control on selling this data. You're first creating a problem by duplicating the data, giving it to more data controllers, and then you can fix the problem partially. Doesn't really make sense to me. If you could go one step further and say, well, if we had a legislation in Europe, which we don't currently, like in California with the California Consumer Privacy Act, where you can say the original data controller, you can deny the original data controller the right to sell your data on the data market. Then you would have a point where you can sort of create data with Facebook, port that data to a PIMS and deny Facebook the sale of the data and just monetize it at the PIMS. And then you could actually have some control. But is that something, this again assumes that sort of Facebook is static and doesn't do anything about it. Of course, if that would be the case, then Facebook would offer you also final control rights in order for you to sort of revoke your denial of them selling the data. Or they would increase the price for using the service or something like this. Yeah? So in the end, of course, they will sort of compete against the PIMS in that dimension. So the PIMS does have a positive effect in that it sort of disciplines Facebook, but it will not be viable with a business model like that, because in the end, Facebook will make sure that you're not using the PIMS and the PIMS is not making any money. Okay, and the third point is on benefiting from the value of the data. So you basically have, let's assume you're using the PIMS nevertheless, you're porting data to the PIMS nevertheless, I would have said before. Can we then sort of make money? Can we actually have this data ownership, and can we actually make money from this? So on this, actually, I have a dedicated paper, dedicated game theoretical paper as well, where we look at this specific scenario. So we contrast, simply speaking, there's more variations of this, but simply speaking, we contrast two worlds. One is a world with personal data broker that sells the data on your behalf, and one is without. In the world without, you just have a monopolistic content and service provider, let's say Facebook. You have a data market where Facebook sells the data and makes some money. And you have consumers that use the service. And the more data they give to the service, the more data they reveal, the better the service gets. So you get some service quality in return. So the more you reveal, the more personalized the content will be, the better the feed will be that you see, and so on. So you have some incentive to reveal some data, but you also have some disincentive if you also have some disincentive potential because they're selling in the data market, and this is where you want to participate in. Now, the world with personal data broker, the same thing happens, but then you have a right to transfer your data from the content and service provider to the personal data broker. And then the data broker will compete in the data market, selling this data with the content and service provider, and will give the consumers a reward depending on how much money it makes up here. So this is the basic setup. And now the question is, what will happen? What will the market outcomes be? And it's a fairly complicated model, so I'm not going to go too much into detail on how we derived and solved it. I'm just going to try to give you the intuition. The first intuition, the first result is that we find out that there's only two possible equilibrium outcomes, generally. The first is what we call a minimum income equilibrium, and the second is what we call a positive income equilibrium. In the minimum income equilibrium, the personal data broker will just pay out a minimum reward, the minimum possible reward. So just offset your transaction costs for using the personal data broker. So transaction cost for example, the privacy concerns you have, or for actually installing a software, something like that. And then in the positive income equilibrium, this is where you actually get a positive reward in excess of your transaction costs for using the personal data broker. So when we think of money, data is labor and data ownership and things like that, then you're actually talking about the positive income equilibrium. Here, you don't really get any value as a consumer from the personal data broker. And now which outcome will emerge will depend on two things mainly. One is the intensity of competition in the data market, and the other is the efficiency of the personal data broker. So the competition intensity is what I alluded to before. It will depend on how much they compete on the same data set. If this is super intense, yeah, then you would be in this graph here, up here, yeah. And the efficiency of the personal data broker is how much, basically, if you can think about how much data, how much value can it derive from data over and beyond the value that the content and service provider can derive. Already made the point before that it's likely that the personal data broker is less efficient than the content and service provider, and then it would have an efficiency lower than 1. And in the event that actually more efficient, then you would be somewhere on the right here. So the first you can see is if there's if it's just as efficient as the content and service provider, yeah, we'll end up in this minimum income equilibrium where consumers do use the PDB, but they're not making any money of it. Yeah? It's just creating competition in the data market, and which then means that because of the content and service provider has less quality, makes less money, it will reduce its quality, which is then bad for consumers. So here, consumer surplus will be lower than if there would not have been any personal data market. Now let's assume the PDB is super efficient for whatever reason. Yeah? And then we can end up in the positive income equilibrium. But there's 2 buts. First is, one of the things that the content and service provider will do, it will change its business model. It will introduce a price being paid. So here the main idea is that now consumers get money for their data, and that money is partially appropriated again by the content and service provider by introducing a price. So consumers, although they get a positive income in terms of a positive reward for their data, they're not necessarily better off than they were without personal data broker, because now they have to pay a positive price, and part of that income goes back to the content and service provider. So in that area up here, we actually have an area where the consumer surplus is still lower. And also the quality is still lower of the content and service provider. And then there is also down here, so we have a super efficient PDB, but we don't have really intense competition on the data market, so the PDB doesn't exert a strong competitive pressure. This is sort of the scenario where actually everyone could be better off. So the consumer surplus is higher, the quality of the content and service provider is higher, and consumers do have to pay a positive price for using Facebook, but they also get a positive reward. Okay. So much for this model, which sort of have this shows you also that it's personal data brokers, even if consumers would use it, do not make consumers better off necessarily. And now if you look at actual business models of these personal data brokers, so actual instantiation of this, they do exist in the real world. And I just named 2 here, there's more examples. One is Coop. Coop also promised that you transfer data to them and you get paid for the data. So exactly the business model I just described. And yeah, it basically, you can still go on the website. I made these screenshots a couple of days ago, but you won't get any money, if you do that. If you look at Coop, they were sending an email to their users on November 19th saying, well, hey, we're shutting down operations. Any data you previously added to the platform was never actually sold. If you received payments in the past that were coming from the Coop treasury account, the server decommission process will erase any data. And so they paid about $8 to some people, but never got paid. So this would be consistent with our so-called minimum income equilibrium. And the same goes for People.io. This is also a platform that proposes money for your data. And you see here from June 22nd, an entry, it doesn't work anymore, feeling ripped off, never get any money, and so on. All right. Now I'm quickly going through, and then because Volker's reminding me already I'm taking too much time. The last 2 things I want to talk about is you can also make money from the data controllers. A business model like that is by Data Wallet. What they basically offer is a compliance service. But of course, who's going to use that service? Only small, relatively small content providers. So this is not going to fix the problem for the large internet controllers, but it might actually work to some degree. What's interesting, if you go on their website and you can sort of change the slider here, and it will show you different prices for different number of users, and the largest you can enter is 1 million, which is not really a lot. Yeah? And then the third and the final is that you can do a sort of from data subjects, so you can sort of get a subscription fee. This is something that, for example, the Joint Data Ethics Commission proposed as the sort of ethical business model. But I think also there's a lot of problems with this. First of all, if there's sort of PIMs like that, there can be ruinous price competition driving the subscription prices down, yet they have actually a large obligation of handling this data well. So how is that going to comply? And is it in line with European values if only people that can afford this monthly subscription fee can handle their data well? I'm not sure. And finally, we can also subsidize these things, do a state-run PIMs. I'm not a big fan of state-run anything. State is not a good entrepreneur, especially in this dynamic environment like that. Is the state actually the better data controller? Also a big question. So finally, this leaves you basically with the only viable solution for this is open source. All right. Now, coming to the policy recommendations, I only have one slide on this, where I sort of bring it all together. There's 3 areas that we identify that we would need to do something more on. First is just as GDPR Article 20 stands right now, a more effective enforcement, and it also seems we're sort of enforcing other parts of GDPR more and more so, but even there is a big debate on enforcement. We all know the debate about the Irish privacy regulators and how they're understaffed and underfinanced. But what's particularly problematic is here the uncertainty in the legal scope of data portability and the rights to others. So we need to define a clearer scope, particularly for enforced data. And there also should be more enforcement on the completeness of this data in this scope. As I said before, if you do data portability requests right now, a lot of observed data will not be included. Then the big policy recommendations that we do make is that we need to move towards a world in the context of the digital economy, and for personal data, a world with more continuous data portability. So where we have real-time data portability using APIs for large data controllers. So there needs to be proportionality principle here as well. But this is something that we need to move to that is actually being used more, because anecdotal evidence suggests that data portability is actually not being much used right now. Then, of course, the devil is in the detail here. There needs to be some implementation. We believe that industry-led implementation and development of standards is probably the best, like it has been done in the free flow of data regulation as well. But there needs to be some governmental oversight of this, because otherwise it will just go into the vested interests of the incumbents. And finally, we do still believe, nevertheless, I've made these points before, that PIMs have an important role to play. But we need to set on open source solutions. And for that to work, we need standards to overcome these large hurdles of sort of needing to have schema mappings and so on. So there need to be also standards for consent management on top of the standards of data flow and data portability that I talked about before. An interesting idea, I think, is that we could couple this with the ongoing efforts on identity management at the European level. And potentially there's also a role here for seals and certification, because we're talking about open source solutions and we're handling with very sensitive types of data. So there needs to be potentially sort of a certification here to overcome the trust issue of consumers. With that, and a little tour de force in the end, which I apologize for, I want to close the talk. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm also very much looking forward to your questions now. Thank you.